The Nevada desert had a way of swallowing sound. On some days, the wind howled across the sand, filling the air with a dry whistle that cut through every earplug and muff. But today, the air was calmer, only a faint breeze shifting the mirages shimmering off the horizon. That stillness made the noise of the outdoor range echo louder. Each rifle shot cracked against the desert floor, rolling away until it faded into the mountains. The weekend crowd was bigger than usual. Pickup trucks lined the gravel lot, their tailgates loaded with rifle cases, ammo boxes, and coolers sweating in the late morning sun. Men in ball caps leaned against benches, laughing and comparing scopes, arguing ballistics, and bragging about hunting trips. Veterans in faded camo stood together, swapping stories that always began with, "Back when I was deployed." At first, no one noticed her. She moved without fanfare, slipping past the groups like she had every right to be there, but no interest in drawing attention. Claire carried a long, narrow rifle case in one hand and a small pack slung over her shoulder. She wasn't dressed like the others, no patches, no gun brand t-shirts, no tactical pants with 10 pockets. Just jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and sunglasses. But what caught their attention wasn't her clothes. It was the case. Bright red. Not the muted, matte finish of a military-grade case, but a striking cherry red hard shell with polished metal latches that glinted in the sun. It looked less like something that belonged on a rifle range, and more like a musician's instrument case, something meant for a stage, not a desert firing line. Whispers started almost instantly. "Look at that," one man muttered, elbowing his buddy. "She's got a toy chest." Another snickered. "What's next? She gonna pull out a Nerf gun?" A ripple of laughter followed, not cruel, just the kind of dismissive amusement men carried when they thought they knew more. Claire heard them, of course she did, but she didn't react. Her pace never faltered. She walked to an empty bench, set the case down with care, and began unclipping the latches. The crowd couldn't help but watch. Even the ones who had been mid-conversation found their words drifting off as curiosity pulled, their eyes toward the woman with the red case. A few leaned back against their benches, arms folded, waiting for the reveal. They were certain it would be a disappointment, the kind of flashy gun meant to look good on Instagram, but useless in real conditions. When the lid opened, sunlight caught the metal inside, reflecting in a brief flash. The rifle she pulled out was no toy. Long, sleek, and unmistakably custom-built, it had a stock painted the same glossy red as the case, polished until it looked like enamel. The barrel was thick, heavy, with a compensator that gleamed under the sun. But it was the scope that drew the sharpest reactions. It wasn't the average hunting optic or standard military glass. This was oversized, stretching almost absurdly long, the kind of scope most people never even saw outside specialized sniper manuals. A whistle came from somewhere down the line. "Jesus, what is that thing?" "Looks like a circus prop," another man muttered, though his voice carried less confidence now. Claire said nothing. She set the rifle on the bench, extended the bipod, and adjusted the legs with precise clicks. Her motions weren't hurried, but they weren't hesitant either. Every movement carried efficiency, like she'd repeated the process so many times her body didn't need conscious thought. The laughter began to falter. One man older, his hat stained from years of sweat and dust, leaned forward, eyes narrowing. He didn't laugh. He watched her hands. He recognized the way she worked the rifle, not like someone showing off, but like someone who'd built muscle memory under pressure. Claire pulled a small notebook from her pack, flipping it open to pages already marked with neat columns of numbers and symbols. She glanced at the horizon, then scribbled something quick. A few of the men craned their necks, trying to see what she was writing, but her body blocked the page. The whispers started again, Lower this time, but sharper. Bet she doesn't even know what she's doing. That red paint's just for Instagram likes. She's wasting everyone's time. And yet, for all the mocking, none of them looked away. The range officer, a broad man in his 50s with mirrored sunglasses, finally strolled over. He carried the air of someone who'd seen it all before, but his curiosity had been piqued like everyone else's. He stopped near her bench, arms crossed. "Ma'am," he said in a polite but skeptical tone, "targets out there are marked at 3,000 meters. That's the farthest we've got today. Just so you know." Claire lifted her head slightly, meeting his reflection in his own glasses. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and even, carrying no hint of bravado. "I'll need 6. A beat of silence followed, and then, almost predictably, the chuckles returned. 6,000 meters? That was beyond absurd. That wasn't just over the maximum, it was double the farthest target most shooters would ever dream of trying. The officer gave her a patient smile, the kind reserved for people who didn't understand how things worked. 6,000? Ma'am, that's beyond this range's capability. That's theoretical. Claire simply nodded. She returned her attention to the notebook, as though his words didn't require acknowledgement. The crowd stirred. "She's nuts. No one's ever hit 6. She's gonna embarrass herself." But the way she carried herself didn't match their expectations. She wasn't nervous, wasn't jittery. There was no false confidence either, no swagger, no grand declarations. Just quiet, methodical preparation. The older man who'd been watching her hands leaned closer to his friend and whispered, "That's not amateur work. Watch her. She's done this before." His friend snorted. "Nobody's done 6,000 before. Not out here." Still, he didn't look away. By the time Claire was finished adjusting her rifle, the laughter had dimmed to low murmurs. The mockery remained, but it was thinner now, laced with uncertainty. People could feel it, the shift in the air, the unspoken possibility that maybe, just maybe, they weren't dealing with an ordinary weekend shooter. The Nevada sun blazed down, heating the benches, reflecting off the barrels and baking the desert floor. Mirage waves danced far in the distance. The targets shimmered like ghosts against the horizon. Claire lowered herself behind the red rifle, body aligning with the weapon in perfect symmetry. And though not a single shot had been fired yet, the range was already quieter than it had been all day. The desert heat pressed down harder as the morning shifted closer to noon. Dust swirled at the edges of the range, kicked up by boots and the occasional gust of dry wind. Shooters down the line were still firing their rifles at closer targets, but their attention kept drifting back toward the woman with the red case. Curiosity had taken root, even in those who had laughed the loudest. Claire, however, seemed unaffected. She moved with quiet deliberation, as if this moment was no different than all the others before it. She didn't flinch at the stares. She didn't rise to the bait of whispered mockery. Instead, she focused entirely on her rifle, on her task. She set the weapon upright against the bench for a moment, the polished red stock catching the light in a way that almost looked theatrical. More laughter rippled down the line. "See what I mean?" A younger man muttered, shaking his head. "That thing's a showpiece. You don't paint a rifle like that unless you're looking for attention." "Yeah," another agreed, smirking. "Looks like she brought a Ferrari to a monster truck rally." But a third shooter, one of the veterans with salt and pepper hair and a USMC cap, didn't laugh. He watched her movements, brow furrowed. "No," he said quietly. "That's not for show." The younger men looked at him. "How can you tell?" "Because," he said, nodding toward Claire, "she hasn't looked at a single one of you. Not once. Doesn't care what you're saying. That's someone who's locked in. I've seen it before." Claire lowered the rifle back to the bench, pulling a cloth from her pack and carefully wiping the scope lens. The glass shimmered in the sunlight, immaculate, flawless. She turned the adjustment knob slowly, listening to each click with a faint nod. Every adjustment was written in her notebook, cross-referenced, then double-checked. To the casual observer, it might have looked obsessive. To anyone with experience, it was discipline. The range officer lingered nearby, arms still crossed. His tone had softened, though he hadn't abandoned skepticism entirely. "That's quite a setup you've got," he said, trying to sound conversational. "What is it, custom?" Claire didn't look up. "Built it myself." A few eyebrows raised at that. Building a rifle of this caliber wasn't like assembling furniture from a manual. It required knowledge, barrel harmonics, tolerances, machining, and ballistics far beyond hobbyist level. Most men on that line hadn't built so much as their own hunting scope mounts. One of them snorted. "Yeah, right? Built it herself. And I guess she painted it with nail polish too." This time, Claire did glance up, just for a heartbeat. Her eyes, hidden partly behind her sunglasses, locked on the man who'd spoken. She didn't frown, didn't smile, didn't even blink. Then she turned back to her work, as though he hadn't existed. That simple look shut him up faster than any retort could have. She loaded a single round into the chamber. The metallic sound of the bolt sliding forward echoed faintly, catching more attention than it should have. Shooters nearby paused mid-action, rifles still in their hands, ears tilted toward her lane. The veteran in the USMC cap leaned forward, elbows on his knees, whispering to no one in particular. "Watch this." Just watch. Claire positioned herself behind the rifle, body folding into place with almost balletic grace. She adjusted the bipod again, pressed the butt into her shoulder, and laid her cheek against the stock. Her breathing slowed. To anyone watching closely, it looked like she had entered another world. The laughter, the heat, the chatter, all of it vanished in her mind. She wasn't performing. She wasn't proving anyone wrong. She was simply doing what she'd always done. The men around her kept whispering, their tone shifting from mocking to uneasy curiosity. "You see how steady she is? Look at those adjustments, like she's done this 1,000 times. Not hobby shooting." The range officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, like I said, 3,000's the max. Anything further, I'll find 6, she said evenly, without lifting her eye from the scope. Her words didn't carry arrogance. They carried certainty. And that certainty unsettled the crowd more than any brag ever could. Someone down the line laughed nervously. 6,000? Lady, you're not hitting the moon. But even he sounded less convinced than before. Claire's hands made their final movements, one on the scope, adjusting for windage, the other steady on the stock. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't hesitating. She was preparing, and every person watching could feel the shift. The atmosphere of the range had changed. The sound of other rifles firing seemed to fade into the background. All eyes gravitated toward her lane. She whispered something under her breath numbers, barely audible. Then she wrote another note in her book, set the pencil down, and exhaled slowly. For a moment, it was as though time itself paused. The bright red rifle, once the butt of every joke, now commanded silence. The men who had mocked her were leaning forward, caught in the gravity of the moment. Even those still firing at their own targets couldn't resist sneaking glances. The range officer no longer looked skeptical. He looked curious, maybe even uneasy. Claire adjusted her grip one last time. She didn't flinch under the weight of 100 eyes. And though she hadn't yet pulled the trigger, the desert was holding its breath. The Nevada desert had shifted into a harsher light, the sun now climbing higher, burning the sky a blinding white. Heat shimmered along the horizon, turning distant rocks into wavering illusions. Claire's target lay far beyond the furthest range marker, a steel plate set nearly 6 kilometers away, invisible without the aid of her massive scope. She adjusted the rifle again, her fingers dancing over the knobs, each click deliberate, precise. The small crowd that had gathered around her lane now held a tangible tension. Those who had mocked the red rifle barely breathed, not daring to break the fragile spell forming over the range. Even the experienced shooters felt it. Something about her movements, her calm, precise gestures, hinted at skill far beyond casual practice. The range officer, still standing nearby, shifted uneasily. He cleared his throat softly, more to himself than anyone else. "I've seen some exceptional shooters," he murmured under his breath. "But this is something else." Claire ignored all of it. Her attention was locked on the scope, her eyes scanning, calculating. She jotted down numbers in her small notebook, quickly scribbled, and then nodded, as if confirming some invisible data in her head. She wasn't worried about ridicule anymore. She was beyond that. She was in a state of total focus, where only physics, wind, distance, and trajectory existed. A young man from the back of the crowd whispered, almost incredulously, She's actually serious." "Yes," said the veteran with the Marine cap, leaning closer to a friend. "And if she knows what she's doing, we're about to see something no one here has ever witnessed." Claire adjusted her position, kneeling slightly, elbows resting firmly on the bench, shoulder pressed into the stock. She breathed slowly and deliberately, lowering her chest closer to the rifle. Her cheek rested lightly against the stock as she peered through the scope. Every second of preparation was purposeful, every adjustment calculated. The heat haze made the distant target shimmer. To anyone untrained, it looked like nothing more than a glimmer of metal, dancing with the mirages of the desert. But to Claire, every tiny detail was visible. The precise angle of the steel plate, the subtle bend in the wind, even the faint heat currents rising from the sand. She calculated, adjusted, and confirmed. The crowd whispered again, a mixture of fear and awe. Some pulled out binoculars, some craned their necks, but none dared to distract her. The air felt charged, as if even the desert was holding its breath. The officer finally stepped closer, lowering his sunglasses. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "you understand that most shooters, even professionals, can't make a consistent shot beyond 3,000 meters?" Claire didn't look at him. "I understand," she said quietly. Her voice carried no arrogance, only quiet certainty. The man beside the officer shook his head, muttering, "You can't just aim at 6,000 meters. It's impossible without a team, a lab, maybe satellite guidance." "She's insane." But Claire didn't flinch. She had done this before. She had practiced conditions far worse, distances far longer. She understood her rifle and its limits, the bullet's trajectory, wind drift, even the rotation of the earth, a subtle but real factor at extreme ranges. A couple of shooters whispered about Coriolis force, air density, and bullet drop, their voices blending technical jargon with disbelief. Claire had already accounted for all of it. Each tiny calculation had been folded into her adjustments. Every number in her notebook was cross-referenced, every scope dial meticulously set. Her breathing slowed even further. One deep inhalation, and she held it, letting her body remain perfectly still. She rested her finger lightly on the trigger, feeling the tension without forcing it. The red rifle, so flashy to the untrained eye, was in fact perfectly balanced, built for extreme precision. In her hands, it seemed less like an object, and more like an extension of her own body. The silence around her had grown heavier. Even the distant shooters were quiet now, glancing occasionally toward her lane with awe. The veteran Marine finally whispered to someone beside him, "If she hits this, it'll be a record for a civilian range." Maybe more. Claire exhaled slightly, enough to release tension, but not disturb her aim. Her finger hovered on the trigger. A subtle flick of her wrist adjusted the parallax, aligning her view perfectly with the distant steel plate. Heat waves danced across the horizon, but her vision was unshaken. Years of training, thousands of rounds fired at impossible distances, had prepared her for this exact moment. One young man in the back whispered, audibly shaking, "She's going to do it. She's actually going to try it." "Yes," said the veteran next to him, voice low. "And mark my words, she's going to make that shot." Claire's notebook had been set aside, her final notes internalized. Her mind ran simulations: wind drift, bullet drop, distance, temperature, humidity, and the Earth's rotation. She had accounted for everything. The world outside the scope no longer mattered. She pressed lightly on the trigger. The red rifle thundered, the recoil snapping her shoulder slightly, but her stance absorbed it perfectly. The bullet launched into the air, disappearing into the shimmering mirage of the distant desert. Every person in the range felt the recoil echo through the ground, though they weren't holding the rifle themselves. All eyes followed the imaginary path of the bullet, some craning to watch, others straining to see through their scopes. Time stretched in a way that only extreme tension can create. Every heartbeat seemed to last longer. Every inhalation carried the collective anticipation of the crowd. Seconds passed. Nothing. The air remained still, dry, shimmering. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, came a faint ping metal against metal. A sound so soft it was almost mist, yet unmistakable. The steel plate at 6,000 meters had been struck dead center. Gasps rippled through the range. A man who had laughed earlier stumbled back, mouth open. "No, no way," he muttered, pointing. That's impossible." The veteran Marine's jaw tightened, eyes wide. "I told you," he said quietly. "She's done this before." Claire stayed behind the rifle, expression calm, as if this were the most ordinary event in the world. She adjusted the scope again, readying for a second round. Precision was her language. The applause or the disbelief was irrelevant. Another bullet snapped from the red rifle. Recoil kicked her shoulder again, but it barely moved her stance. Seconds later, another ping echoed from the distant center hit, again. Every observer froze, the desert suddenly silent, except for the faint hum of wind. Those who had mocked her now stared, mouths agape, unsure whether to cheer, bow their heads, or question their own skills. Even the officer, hardened by decades at the range, stared in disbelief. That was, he stammered. "I've never seen anything like it." Claire finally lowered the rifle, wiped her brow lightly, and exhaled. No words were necessary. The silence, the awe, the stunned gazes of the shooters spoke louder than any congratulations could. The red rifle, once derided, had demanded and received respect. The desert seemed to exhale. For a few long seconds, all sound had vanished, except for the faint wind across the sand. The distant mountains glimmered in the mirage haze, but Claire's gaze never wavered from the red rifle, and the scope aligned on the target. She had made the impossible shot, but she wasn't finished. Precision demanded repetition. Confidence demanded consistency. And she had promised herself she would not fail twice. Around her, the crowd had gone completely still. Men who had laughed and mocked her barely moved. Their rifles were forgotten on the benches beside them. Even those still in their lanes paused mid-motion. Whispers had shifted from derision to disbelief. "She hit it. Twice in a row," one shooter muttered, unable to hide his awe. Another, younger and still pale from shock, whispered, "How? She doesn't even look like she's breathing hard." The veteran Marine shifted on his knees, squinting through his binoculars. "That's not luck," he said softly. "That's skill, beyond anything I've seen outside special operations. She's Remarkable. Claire didn't respond. She remained kneeling behind her rifle, recording data in her mind rather than on paper this time. Even as she glanced at the scope, adjusting for subtle shifts in wind, she was already calculating the trajectory for a third round. Her discipline was surgical, her focus absolute. The desert wind had shifted slightly since her first shot. Heat waves shimmered differently now, bending the mirage along the horizon. Small gusts brushed against the rifle, subtle but measurable if you were trained to feel them. Claire's fingers adjusted the elevation knob carefully, listening to the click of each rotation. The red rifle was heavy, but she handled it like it weighed nothing. A few shooters were now straining through their own scopes, attempting to follow the bullet's trajectory. Most were amateurs in comparison. None had fired beyond 3,000 meters, and certainly not with such precision. The tiny steel plate, barely a square meter in size, had vanished into the mirage of 6 kilometers distance. And yet, Claire's sighting reticle held it steady, like a magnet drawing her focus. The range officer, still standing nearby, finally cleared his throat. He seemed torn between disbelief and cautious admiration. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've seen many expert marksmen in my career, including military snipers with special training. But this hitting the target at 6,000 meters consecutively, that's unprecedented." Claire didn't look at him. She didn't need validation. Her eyes scanned the horizon. She had studied heat mirages, the air's refractive index, even the subtle effects of humidity on her bullet. Every calculation, every observation mattered. She had to account for the smallest discrepancy. Another shooter whispered, barely audible, "Do you see the way she's holding it? Like the rifle's part of her body. I've never seen someone this precise." "Yeah," the veteran Marine said. "You don't get this by luck. She's done this before, and she's done it in worse conditions." Claire exhaled slowly, letting her body remain perfectly still. She leaned slightly forward, cheek pressed firmly against the stock, and allowed her mind to run through the sequence. Wind drift, bullet drop, Coriolis effect, even minor rotation of the Earth. Everything had to be accounted for. A single miscalculation could send the bullet meters off course. The target shimmered in the heat, dancing ever so slightly, a visual echo of the desert itself. Claire adjusted the scope, just a fraction of a millimeter, as precise as a surgeon with a scalpel. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing remained controlled. The red rifle, so often mocked for its color, was now a silent instrument of mastery in her grip. The crowd watched, frozen. They had gone from disbelief to astonishment. Some whispered predictions. Others stayed silent, unwilling to risk breaking the tension. A few tried to argue that she couldn't possibly maintain this level of precision. But all of them knew, in the back of their minds, that she already had. Claire's next movement was subtle but calculated. She loaded another round with a mechanical precision that suggested years of repetitive, disciplined training. The metallic click of the bolt echoed faintly, reverberating through the range, a sound that now carried weight and expectation rather than mockery. The officer whispered to himself, almost reverent, "She's not just hitting a target. She's rewriting what I thought was possible." The young man in the back, still pale from earlier shock, tried to whisper a question, but his voice caught. "How? How does she do it?" The veteran beside him shook his head. "Experience, discipline, hours in the desert alone. Practice in conditions you couldn't imagine." Claire exhaled again, lightly this time releasing any tension while maintaining complete stability. She lined up the reticle with the distant steel plate, tracking the slight sway of the mirage. Her finger brushed the trigger, steady as a heartbeat. A moment of complete silence followed, broken only by the soft hum of the desert wind. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Not a single movement from the crowd, not a cough, not a footstep. All of them instinctively understood that this moment belonged entirely to Claire. The rifle cracked again. The recoil rolled through her shoulder, and the bullet screamed toward the horizon. The time between firing and impact seemed eternal. Every eye strained, every mind held in suspended disbelief. Then ping. The steel plate vibrated. Dead center. Again, gasps erupted, though almost no one moved. The sound seemed unreal, like a dream made manifest. Several shooters leaned against their benches, mouths open, not sure whether to cheer or bow their heads. Even the officer blinked, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with his decades of experience. "She's done it again," the veteran Marine whispered. "Twice in a row. 6,000 meters. Incredible." Claire didn't react. She lowered her cheeks slightly, glanced through the scope, and calculated. Heat shimmer, wind angle, bullet trajectory, air density, all were factored for the third round. The rifle rested perfectly in her hands, red stock gleaming in the sun, polished metal glinting. To any observer, it looked impossibly stable, as though the weapon itself defied physics. Around the range, the whispers grew louder. But they were no longer mocking. They were off-illed murmurs, conversations tinged with disbelief. "She's not human," one man said quietly, almost to himself. "Military sniper?" asked another, unsure. "I've never seen a civilian capable of this. She must be ex-special forces or something," a third whispered, shaking his head. Claire ignored them all. The world had narrowed down to a single point, the target 6 kilometers away. Her mind calculated, predicted, and adjusted in real time. The third shot would prove whether this was skill or luck. She inhaled slowly, letting the air fill her lungs, then exhaled partially, steadying herself. Her finger hovered on the trigger. Every muscle in her body was tense but controlled. She squeezed gently. The rifle cracked. Recoil struck her shoulder, but she absorbed it perfectly. The bullet tore across the desert, invisible in its speed, only traceable through the slight hum of wind it disturbed. Ping. Dead center again. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, others gasped audibly. A man stumbled backward, dropping his rifle, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The officer's mouth opened in surprise, but no words came. He simply shook his head slowly, adjusting his sunglasses, trying to process the precision he had just seen. Claire finally lowered the rifle. Her breathing remained controlled. She wiped her brow lightly, then tucked the weapon back onto its bipod. The red rifle, once the target of ridicule, had achieved something extraordinary. Its color no longer mattered. Its power and precision now spoke for themselves. Around her, the range remained charged with awe. People whispered, questioned, stared, and tried to analyze what they had witnessed. But one thing was clear. Claire was not ordinary. She was something far beyond their expectations. And she wasn't done yet. The desert stretched endlessly, heat waves rippling across the sand like liquid gold. The sun was climbing higher, baking the gravel and steel targets with unforgiving intensity. But no one seemed to notice the heat anymore, not the veterans, not the young hobbyists, not even the range officer. All eyes were fixed on Claire, kneeling behind her cherry-red rifle, an instrument of precision that had defied expectations. The echo of her last shot still hung faintly in the desert air, like a ghost of sound. Ping. That small metallic note, once barely perceptible, had carried far more weight than anyone could have imagined. Dead center. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. And at 6,000 meters. The reality of what they had witnessed began to sink in slowly. Some of the men clutched their benches for support, stunned. Others simply leaned forward, unable to speak, their mouths agape. The laughter and ridicule that had filled the range hours ago had completely vanished. In its place was awe, uncertainty, and for a few, something bordering on reverence. The range officer stepped closer, still shielding his eyes from the harsh sun. His voice was quiet, almost reverential. "Ma'am, that shot. Those shots. No one I've known, no one has done that before." Claire lowered her rifle slightly, but not entirely. She didn't smile, nor did she seek praise. There was no performance in her actions, no showmanship. She simply exhaled, steadying herself, and returned her gaze to the horizon. Precision demanded repetition, not applause. Every movement had been calculated, every adjustment intentional. The veteran Marine shifted slightly, leaning on his elbows. "I've trained snipers for decades," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "Some of the best I've seen never hit that consistently at half the distance. She's extraordinary." A younger shooter beside him whispered, his voice trembling. "How is that possible? Even with modern military rifles, that's beyond human." "Experience," the Marine said, eyes still fixed on Claire. "Discipline. Hours in isolation, practicing under conditions you and I can't imagine. This isn't luck. It's mastery." Claire reloaded the rifle with mechanical precision, bolt clicking softly into place. She paused, scanning the horizon through her scope again. The desert shimmered, mirages bending the view, the wind teasing the trajectory with subtle gusts. Each environmental factor, no matter how minor, was being accounted for in her mind. The young man in the back whispered again, this time barely audible. "She's calculating everything. Every detail. Every little variable." The officer adjusted his sunglasses, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe what I'm seeing. This is beyond anything I've witnessed on a civilian range." Around the benches, the murmurs had grown into a quiet collective awe. "She's unstoppable. No way that's a civilian rifle. Ex-Special Forces, maybe?" Each person tried to rationalize what they had seen, but words failed them. Claire exhaled slowly, allowing herself a moment of stillness. Her finger hovered lightly on the trigger, not from nervousness, but from discipline. The rifle, once mocked for its cherry-red finish, had become an extension of her body. It was precise, deadly, and elegant all at once. To anyone else, it was a weapon. To her, it was a tool perfectly tuned to the laws of physics and her own skill. She adjusted the elevation dial ever so slightly, accounting for the shifting heat waves. The faintest gust of wind rippled past her, brushing against her sleeve, but she hardly noticed. Each variable had been calculated, each factor accounted for. Even the mirage dancing over the distant plate couldn't deceive her eyes. The crowd remained silent, holding their collective breath, waiting for what might happen next. Even those who had initially mocked her now stared in disbelief, unwilling to blink, afraid of missing the next moment. The officer finally spoke again, almost cautiously. "Ma'am, how do you maintain that accuracy at such distance? It's physics beyond ordinary comprehension." Claire's voice was calm, almost detached. "Discipline, repetition, observation. Every shot is a calculation, not a guess." Some of the shooters looked at each other, realizing that what they had assumed was luck was, in fact, pure skill honed through years of meticulous practice. One of them whispered, "She's not just good, she's a professional in her own right." Claire loaded a second round, this time with no hesitation, no sign of strain. The metallic click of the bolt echoed lightly in the desert, but in that quiet, even the smallest sound felt significant. She exhaled, her focus absolute, and positioned herself behind the scope. Every muscle in her body was tuned to precision. Every thought focused solely on the distant steel target. The crowd leaned forward instinctively. Even those who were seasoned shooters or veterans of military service found themselves captivated. They were witnessing a performance unlike any other, a demonstration of skill, patience, and discipline that surpassed even their highest expectations. Claire took a final glance at the mirage-distorted plate, adjusting for wind drift. She held her breath, letting her body remain perfectly still. And then she squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the recoil snapping her shoulder slightly, though her stance absorbed it perfectly. The bullet tore across the desert with an almost inaudible whoosh. Every eye followed its imaginary path, straining to see its invisible trajectory. Seconds passed like minutes. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the metallic ping. Dead center. Gasps spread through the range. A few shooters stumbled backward, disbelief etched into their faces. One of the younger men dropped his notebook in astonishment. Even the range officer took a step back, shaking his head, trying to reconcile reality with what he had just seen. She did it again, the veteran Marine whispered, his voice low, awed. 3 rounds. Consecutive. 6,000 meters. Claire finally lowered the rifle. She didn't speak, didn't celebrate, didn't allow herself any emotion. Precision was her language. Everything else was secondary. The red rifle, once the target of ridicule, had proven itself beyond question. The range remained silent for a moment, then whispers began again, this time filled with respect rather than mockery. She's phenomenal. I've never seen that in my life. That's professional sniper level. Even the men who had laughed at the bright red rifle hours ago now stood still, uncertain how to react. Some nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a silent salute to skill beyond their comprehension. Others remained frozen, trying to reconcile their initial judgment with the reality they had just witnessed. Claire packed the rifle away methodically, still calm, still in control. Every movement was deliberate. There was no rush, no performance. She simply placed the weapon in its case, clicked the latches closed, and slung it over her shoulder. The desert seemed to hold its breath a moment longer, as if even the earth itself recognized the precision she had demonstrated. Around her, the crowd began to murmur, and one by one, a few of the veterans gave her the nod of respect reserved for those who had proven themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Claire took a slow, deliberate step back from the bench, surveying the range one last time. Her bright red rifle had been mocked, doubted, and ridiculed, but now it commanded respect. She had made the impossible look routine, and she had done it without fanfare, without spectacle, with nothing but her discipline and skill. And as she walked away, the desert wind carried whispers of disbelief and awe. For everyone present, the memory of that day, the red rifle, the impossible shot, the silence after the metallic ping would linger forever. The sun had climbed even higher, casting a harsh glare across the Nevada desert, yet no one seemed to notice the heat. Claire's bright red rifle, now packed neatly into its case, had shifted the energy of the entire range. Where there had been chatter, laughter, and light-hearted jabs, there was now silence, a reverent stillness, punctuated only by the occasional murmur of disbelief. The veteran Marine, who had been watching from the sidelines, shook his head slowly. "I've trained snipers for decades," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and I've never seen anything like this. She's extraordinary." His eyes remained locked on Claire as she adjusted her gear, checking each strap and zipper with meticulous care. There was no urgency in her movements, no sign of fatigue or triumph, only the calm efficiency of someone in total command of her craft. One of the younger shooters, who had been particularly vocal in mocking the red rifle hours earlier, stumbled back a step, jaw slack. He muttered under his breath, How is that even possible?" The Marine shook his head again. Experience, discipline, hundreds, maybe thousands of hours practicing under impossible conditions. You don't get that kind of skill overnight. The range officer, now standing a few feet away, finally stepped closer, his brow furrowed with disbelief. He had witnessed countless marksmen and special operations personnel, yet what he had seen from Claire defied everything he thought he knew. "Ma'am," he said carefully, almost reverently, I've never seen shots at this distance perfect. Consecutive hits by anyone on a civilian range." Claire didn't look up from her adjustments. Her voice was steady, quiet, and deliberate. "I know my rifle, I know my rounds, and I know the environment. That's all that matters." The officer exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Environment, yes. But even with perfect knowledge, what you've just done, it's remarkable." Meanwhile, the crowd of shooters and spectators had begun to murmur among themselves, their disbelief slowly giving way to a mix of respect, awe, and tentative admiration. Some were talking in hushed tones. "Did you see that? Dead center? 6,000 meters. She's a professional. There's no other explanation. I've trained military snipers, and I still can't comprehend that kind of precision." A few men moved closer to get another look, craning their necks to see Claire packing her case, noting the calm determination on her face. Even as she moved, adjusting straps and making sure her rifle was secured, there was an aura of control that radiated from her. Every step she took, every motion of her hands, was deliberate. She wasn't just competent, she was commanding the space around her. The Marine leaned closer to the officer. "You see that?" he said quietly. "That's someone who's not showing off. She doesn't need to. That's pure skill, and it's intimidating in its simplicity." The officer nodded, still trying to process the reality of what had just occurred. "It's unsettling," he admitted, "to see that level of precision without a team, without a controlled environment." She did it alone. Claire, having finished securing her rifle, finally stood upright. She slung the red case over her shoulder and took a few deliberate steps away from the bench. The desert heat pressed down, but she seemed unaffected. Her calm, measured pace contrasted sharply with the flustered and stunned reactions of the men around her. Some of the younger shooters, still wide-eyed, whispered to one another, "She doesn't even look like she's tired. She just did it." Another added, "She doesn't celebrate. She doesn't even smile. She just walks away like it's nothing." Claire paused for a moment, turning slightly toward the crowd. There was no arrogance in her gaze, no desire for attention, only quiet acknowledgement. One of the veterans, unable to contain himself any longer, stepped forward and offered a subtle nod, a silent salute of respect that spoke louder than words ever could. Others quickly followed suit, some uncertain, some instinctively recognizing skill that demanded deference. The officer, after a long pause, finally spoke. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. That was beyond anything I've witnessed in my career. You've set a standard that's, frankly, unimaginable." Claire gave a small nod, her face calm and unreadable. "It's not about standards," she said simply. "It's about knowing your equipment, knowing yourself, and respecting the environment." The officer exhaled, shaking his head slowly. "Respect the environment, yes. But what you've done today, it's more than that. You've redefined what's possible on this range." Meanwhile, the murmurs around the benches continued. The men who had mocked her red rifle hours ago now exchanged sheepish glances. Some avoided her gaze entirely, unwilling to confront their earlier arrogance. Others stepped closer, trying to reconcile the ridicule they had shown with the undeniable mastery they had just witnessed. A few shooters who had been more experienced than most whispered among themselves, "That kind of precision? It's not civilian level. She must have military training. There's no other explanation. She's done this before, repeatedly, That's obvious. She's remarkable. Claire didn't acknowledge any of it. Her focus had already shifted. She moved to the edge of the firing line, placing the case carefully on the gravel, checking the latches one final time. Even as the whispers and murmurs swirled around her, she maintained her composure. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, and efficient. She had proven her skill, but she wasn't finished. Precision demanded continued attention. Mastery required consistent demonstration. The Marine, watching her, finally muttered to no one in particular, "She doesn't need to show off. She just does it." That's what separates the extraordinary from the ordinary. The officer, still incredulous, adjusted his sunglasses. "I don't know if anyone will believe this outside of this range," he admitted, "even seeing it firsthand. It defies logic." Claire knelt once more, this time setting up for one final demonstration. The red rifle, now fully secure in its case, was out again, gleaming under the unforgiving desert sun. She positioned it with the same deliberate precision she had shown for every previous shot. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, anticipation crackling through the air. Every man, woman, and officer present knew that what they were about to witness was not casual shooting. It was the culmination of decades of experience, thousands of rounds fired, and an intimate understanding of the desert, the wind, and the physics of extreme-range ballistics. Claire's finger hovered lightly on the trigger, her eyes scanning the horizon through the scope. The heat shimmer distorted the distant target slightly, but she had accounted for it. Every calculation had been made, every variable considered. The desert, the sun, the wind, the bullet, the rifle, they were all aligned. And when she finally squeezed the trigger, the sound was like thunder, sharp and precise. The recoil rolled through her shoulder, absorbed perfectly by her stance. The bullet vanished into the desert mirage, invisible to all but the scope. Seconds later, a faint ping confirmed what everyone had already suspected: dead center again. A crowd erupted, some clapping, others simply staring, mouths agape. Even the officer, who had witnessed countless expert shooters, could do nothing but shake his head in stunned disbelief. Claire finally lowered the rifle, breathing steady, her face calm and unreadable. The red rifle had gone from the target of mockery to the object of awe and respect. In the desert heat, amid the whispering crowd and astonished veterans, she had proven that mastery was not about display, but about precision, discipline, and unwavering focus. The desert had grown oppressive under the relentless sun, but the range felt electrified with tension. Every shooter, veteran, and observer seemed suspended in a shared awe. The bright red rifle, once mocked as a frivolous display, had become a symbol of exacting skill, precision, and quiet authority. The metallic echoes of her shots still resonated off the distant mountains, a reminder of what had been accomplished. Claire moved with deliberate calm, setting the rifle carefully on its bipod. She adjusted the scope with meticulous care, her fingers brushing each dial lightly. Each adjustment was precise, practiced, and deliberate, every small movement measured and accounted for. Even those who had mocked her hours earlier recognized now that she was in a different league. The veteran Marine, who had been silent for a long while, finally stepped closer to the officer. "I've trained the best snipers in the Corps," he said quietly, "and I can tell you this. She's operating at a level that most military teams couldn't replicate without days of preparation. And she's doing it alone." The officer nodded, still adjusting his sunglasses, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed. "Unreal," he whispered, almost to himself. "Even seeing it in person, it doesn't seem possible." Claire exhaled slowly, keeping her body relaxed yet alert. Her mind was running through calculations for one final demonstration. The previous shots had proven her precision, but mastery demanded consistency. She had to show, even if just to herself, that this level of skill was repeatable. that her success wasn't luck, chance, or coincidence. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, their focus riveted on her every move. No one spoke. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath in recognition of the quiet intensity emanating from the kneeling woman behind the red rifle. Claire's finger hovered lightly on the trigger. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. The scope lined up perfectly on the steel plate at 6,000 meters. The heat shimmer bending the horizon, the wind shifting faintly. Every environmental factor had been accounted for. Every calculation had been cross-checked in her mind. She had anticipated everything, except, perhaps, the disbelief still radiating from the crowd. The first round cracked sharply, echoing over the desert floor. Recoil rolled through her shoulder, absorbed flawlessly. Seconds later, a faint metallic ping confirmed the hit dead center once again. The veteran Marine's jaw tightened, his eyes wide. "Consistency," he murmured. "That's not luck. That's skill. Pure, unadulterated skill." The range officer, shaking his head slowly, spoke again. "Ma'am, you've done something here that very few in the world could even attempt. To do it repeatedly. This is beyond words." Claire finally lowered the rifle slightly, her eyes scanning the desert as though evaluating the results herself. She wasn't performing. She wasn't seeking praise. Every motion was rooted in discipline, focus, and mastery. Around the benches, the murmurs had transformed completely. Where there had once been ridicule, there was now admiration, awe, and for some, the beginnings of reverence. The men who had laughed earlier now exchanged hesitant glances, unsure of how to approach her or even whether they should speak. One young shooter whispered to his neighbor, almost inaudibly, "She? She's not human. That kind of precision? I've never seen anything like it." Another added, "I thought the first shot was a fluke. Then the second, then the third. She's extraordinary." The veteran Marine finally spoke aloud, directing his words toward Claire without needing her acknowledgement. "You've earned the respect of every shooter on this range today. Not for your rifle, not for your color choices, but for your skill. That's all that matters." Claire nodded slightly, a subtle acknowledgement. Her gaze didn't seek approval, but her stance suggested recognition of the respect she had earned. She had shown mastery, and the crowd had understood it without her needing to declare it. Even the range officer seemed humbled. "I've seen countless shooters in my career," he said slowly, "but what you've demonstrated today, it will be remembered long after we've forgotten every other shot fired on this range. You've set a benchmark." Claire adjusted her stance one final time, her hands gliding over the polished red stock of the rifle. The case behind her gleamed in the sun, a silent reminder of how far she had come from skepticism and mockery to undeniable authority. She exhaled slowly, her mind calculating, observing, and preparing. The crowd had shifted closer, unable to resist witnessing the quiet precision of her movements. Each eye traced her motions, the careful adjustments of the scope, the precise placement of the bipod, the way her fingers hovered over the trigger. Every detail exuded competence. Every gesture suggested a practiced rhythm refined over countless repetitions. A young man finally found his voice. "Excuse me," he said cautiously. "Can I ask? Have you trained in the military?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She paused, letting the silence hold for just a moment longer. Then, with calm precision, she replied, "I've trained where it matters, alone, with discipline. Every day, for years." Her words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. She didn't boast. She didn't exaggerate. She simply stated a fact, one that the crowd now understood without needing embellishment. The veteran Marine finally gave a small nod, almost in approval. "That's all you need," he muttered. "Skill, discipline, and focus. Nothing else matters. Claire knelt, prepared for one final demonstration. The steel plate glimmered faintly in the heat shimmer, 6,000 meters away. The wind had shifted slightly, but her calculations accounted for every gust, every wave of heat, every variable in the desert environment. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, the anticipation palpable. Even those who had mocked her earlier now felt a profound respect for her abilities. Every shot fired, every adjustment made, had commanded recognition, and now the desert itself seemed to acknowledge her skill. She exhaled slowly, held her breath, and pressed her finger to the trigger. The rifle cracked again, recoil rolling perfectly through her shoulder. The bullet vanished into the mirage, invisible but precise. Seconds later, a faint metallic ping confirmed the hit center, perfect, consistent. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Some clapped, some shook their heads in disbelief, and others simply stared, unable to articulate the awe they felt. The officer stepped forward, adjusting his sunglasses, still trying to comprehend the extraordinary display. Claire finally lowered the rifle, her breathing steady. She wiped a faint bead of sweat from her brow and returned the weapon to its case with deliberate care. The bright red rifle, once the target of derision, now commanded universal respect. As she stood upright, the desert wind brushing against her, the murmurs of the crowd shifted from disbelief to admiration. One by one, veterans and shooters alike began nodding, acknowledging the mastery she had demonstrated. Even those who had mocked her color choices now recognized that skill, discipline, and precision were far more powerful than appearances. Claire adjusted her pack, slung the case over her shoulder, and began walking away from the firing line. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly before her, but every footstep carried quiet authority. She had proven herself beyond question. She had turned ridicule into respect, and established a standard few could even comprehend. Behind her, the crowd slowly began to recover. The murmurs became conversation, the whispers became discussion, and stories of the red rifle and the woman who commanded it would soon spread far beyond this range. The impossible had been achieved. Mastery had been demonstrated, and the legend of Claire and her red rifle was just beginning. The desert sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the range. The air shimmered from heat, yet the energy at the firing line remained charged. Claire's bright red rifle, now tucked securely in its case, had transformed the atmosphere entirely. Where there had been laughter, skepticism, and casual mockery hours before, there was now quiet reverence. Every shooter, veteran, and observer understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of skill, focus, and discipline that few could comprehend. The veteran Marine finally broke the silence, his voice low and respectful. "I've trained snipers for decades," he said quietly, "and I can tell you, what we've seen here today is rare, exceptional, beyond ordinary human capability." His gaze followed Claire as she packed the rifle, every movement deliberate, efficient, and measured. Even without words, the authority she exuded was unmistakable. The range officer, still in disbelief, adjusted his sunglasses and nodded slowly. "Ma'am, I've seen countless shooters, including military snipers with extensive training. But what you've done here today, hitting 6,000-meter targets with such consistency, it's remarkable, unprecedented." Claire acknowledged the compliment with a subtle nod, her expression calm, unreadable. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't perform for applause. Mastery, for her, was its own reward. Every motion, every calculation, every perfectly placed shot was a testament to her discipline and dedication. Around the benches, murmurs of astonishment grew louder. The men who had laughed at the red rifle hours earlier now exchanged glances, some sheepish, others tentative, uncertain how to approach or even react. Yet respect permeated the air. One young shooter whispered, "She's extraordinary. How does someone achieve that?" The Marine replied quietly, "Years of practice, discipline, countless hours in isolation, perfecting every calculation. That's not talent, it's mastery." Claire, meanwhile, adjusted her pack and slung the rifle case over her shoulder. The desert wind rustled her hair, carrying away the tension, but leaving the weight of awe in its wake. She took deliberate steps away from the benches, her posture confident yet unassuming. Every eye followed her. Every whisper trailed in her wake. The officer, still struggling to comprehend, asked aloud, "Mom, do you plan to continue shooting professionally? Competitions? Military contracting?" Claire paused for a moment, considering the question. She finally responded, voice quiet but firm, "I shoot because I respect the craft. The environment, the equipment, the physics mastery is its own reward. Recognition is secondary. Respect comes from consistency, not spectacle." Her words resonated. The crowd fell silent again, absorbing the meaning behind her measured response. It wasn't arrogance, it was a philosophy, one rooted in discipline and mastery. The red rifle, now legendary in the minds of those who had mocked it, had become a symbol of that philosophy. The Marine nodded subtly, almost in agreement. "Discipline over ego," he murmured. "That's what separates the exceptional from the ordinary." Even the young shooters were quiet now, understanding that they had been witness to something rare and profound. They whispered among themselves, trying to articulate what they had seen. She didn't just hit the target, she dominated it. It's not luck, not talent. It's focus, mastery, and discipline. The red rifle. It was never about color. It was always about precision. Claire continued walking slowly, leaving the firing line behind. She had proven her mastery repeatedly, and the desert itself seemed to acknowledge her achievement. Each step was deliberate, quiet, and assured. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The impact of her demonstration would linger far longer than any physical presence could. The officer spoke once more, almost reverently. "I will report this. Formally. What you've done is beyond standard protocol, beyond expectation. People will want to know your methods, your equipment, your training. But even seeing it firsthand, it's difficult to fully comprehend." Claire gave a faint nod, acknowledging the sentiment without providing more detail. The mystery of her skill, her precise training, and her unmatched discipline remained intact. She had achieved something that few could replicate, and she intended to keep her methodology to herself. Mastery was personal. The Marine stepped forward and called out to the group, "Everyone, remember this day? Remember what you saw. The lessons aren't just in hitting a target. They're in preparation, focus, and discipline. The rest is secondary." The crowd, veterans and civilians alike, nodded. The lesson was clear. Claire had demonstrated the power of absolute mastery, not just skill with a rifle. She had turned skepticism into awe, ridicule into respect, and casual observation into a lesson on precision. As she moved toward the edge of the range, she paused and surveyed the desert. The heat shimmered above the sand like waves of molten gold. The distant steel plate, now struck repeatedly, gleamed faintly in the sunlight. She had proven what she needed to prove, not to the crowd, but to herself. Her work was complete. Behind her, whispers continued. The legend of the red rifle and the woman who commanded it would spread far beyond this range. Shooters would recount the day they witnessed impossible precision. Veterans would share the story in hushed tones. Young shooters would carry it as inspiration and a reminder of what true discipline could achieve. The officer called after her once more. "Ma'am, thank you. What you've shown us today, it will be remembered for a long time." Claire paused, looking over her shoulder briefly. Her expression was calm, almost imperceptible, but her eyes reflected a quiet acknowledgement. She didn't need to say more. The record of her skill had been made, and it spoke louder than words ever could. She turned back to the desert, walking away with steady, measured steps. Each stride carried the confidence of someone who had mastered not only her craft, but herself. The echoes of her shots lingered in the air, the metallic ping of precision repeating in memory long after the bullets had struck. The red rifle, once mocked, had become legendary. Claire, once underestimated, had proven that skill, discipline, and focus could overcome doubt, ridicule, and disbelief. The desert remained vast and indifferent, but those who had witnessed her mastery carried its lessons forever. And in that quiet acknowledgement, the story closed not with fanfare, not with spectacle, but with the enduring power of demonstrated mastery. The impossible had been achieved. The legend of Claire and her red rifle would persist, whispered in ranges, recounted in awe, and remembered as a testament to what discipline and precision could accomplish.